Yes. And that, to the very first point, instead of plane noise overflight committee, recognizing that there are some people who it's not technically overflights that cause them distress from noise from the airport, people who live in proximity on Maury, that we thought this would be a more inclusive name for the committee.
Good.
So we're wanting to go with that.
Okay.
This is when we met, and the people that were present. The meeting minutes have full details, and including kind of small little bios on the people that were present. Dean is very interesting because he's been a military and civilian pilot for over 20 years, and flying large planes, mainly out of BFI right now, not SeaTac, but that was a very good perspective to have. So this brief one will only generally cover the noise monitor because we have a short amount of time for this. Next gen is an endless well that you could go into, and we could spend hours on that. So I'm not going to. Only when things directly impact the selection of a site will I go into that. The one exception is I get asked two questions a lot, and it's best to present this visually. People say, well, how busy is SeaTac? How has it changed over the years? This is how it's changed over the years since 1968. You can see we're in a growth pattern in operations and passengers until 9/11, and then it crashed after that. We kind of bumped along the bottom until about 2012, which is when two things happened. Delta added us as a hub, and that was a major thing. They're now on lockstep with Alaska Airlines in terms of operations. And also we had secular growth in the economy in the Puget Sound area. Those two things together fed both the operation count and the passenger count. You'll notice what happened after 2001. As an aside here, is that we had fewer operations but more passengers. Those that were flying might remember planes got a lot more crowded after 9/11. So that's a good thing for carbon emissions, that you want planes packed as much as possible. Maybe not right now, COVID-19, but in general, you want planes packed as much as possible. That's the most efficient way to run them. And also larger planes. People also ask what's happened since COVID-19. This is a chart showing green is this year. Red is last year, and blue is that year of 2012, which was the bottom of the recent trough. So what it means is we're almost to the point where we were kind of our low point after 9/11. So it's a really interesting perspective here. These are on weeks. That's because this is the way the port publishes the data. Once a week they put out new data, and so I put it in this graph, and it gives you an idea kind of how operations are recovering. And you'll see there's a generally fall off in the fall, and that's where we're following that pattern right now.
What caused that big drop I see?
Which one?
The one on the green pattern, you said that's the recent one?
That's COVID-19. I mean, if you look at the dates there, that's week number 10. That's like the first week of March. And that's the huge fall off. And it's important to understand operations fell about 80%. Yes, Nick? You have a little circle on you, so I think you're...
It's really small and light on the side.
These slides will be posted, so you can look at them as well. Passenger counts dropped 95% at the lowest point. So planes were flying, many of them almost empty, and that's why you see the... Anyway, that's just an interesting tidbit that's very topical given our current COVID-19. All right, so for a noise monitor, generally you want to put it in, this is kind of common sense, is the location that has the closest approach to the most number of overflights, right? That you have overflights that are all clustered in a certain area, and then you want to put the lowest point in that area to collect the most noise. You want it free from extraneous extra man-made noise, because one of the important things here is the contrast between the background level and the overflight noise, which is a big difference between Vashon and, say, Federal Way or right near the airport, where you're right by a freeway, say. So the same level of noise from an overflight would make much more an effect here on Vashon than it would there, because it's drowned out by all the traffic on the freeway. So it's important to have that, and we don't want to artificially create extra noise. For instance, being right next to the ferry dock would not be where you'd want to put it. And it's not just man-made noise, it's also sounds of nature, because the sound meters don't have a way to account for what's pleasant and unpleasant sound, right? They just, sound is sound is sound. It's acoustic energy. And so for me, listening to birds is very pleasant, whereas listening to planes isn't. But to a noise meter, they're all the same. And so I don't know if any of you have ponds. I have a pond, and when the frogs get going, They're very, very loud, and so you would not want to put a noise monitor next to a pond. That's an example. Yes, Nick?
What about the state lands that are right up there behind Mukai? If we get something inside those trees, it's going to be very quiet.
Yeah, well, let's. I have coming up, so you'll see that. The port uses Verizon Wireless as a data uplink, so we needed to have coverage for Verizon Wireless. The monitor plus the wireless modem takes about 5 watts of power. Potential solar options there as well, or the most convenient is to have hardwired power, and this was a port requirement that it be on public property. So they only have to deal with the public agency, not individuals who can be odd sometimes. Shows the current flight paths. The airport, this is kind of Airport 101, but they operate either in 2 different flows, north flow or south flow, depending on how they take off and land. Generally, it's better when planes take off and land into the wind because it reduces their ground speed for the same amount of lift. In the Seattle area, about 75% of our operations are in south flow, which means they're actually flying north over the island. These are arrivals. And in this map here, the arrivals are in red and the departures are in green. So you see they're flying north over Vashon. They make a U-turn at some point to then land south into the wind at the airport. So they're descending as they're heading south. And you have to understand, if you look at this picture of Vashon, there's that one thin red line. Well, that one thin red line feeds that whole mass of webs of all the red lines above it. So within that one little red line are 250 arrivals in a 100-yard wide track. That's next gen. That was what the change was. And then they lowered the altitude about 2,000 feet. Reasons they're too complicated to go into right now. So the lowest point is going to be as it's descending at the north tip of the island. And so that's also under 250 arrivals a day. So the ideal place to put it would be right under that, right before it goes offshore, basically. Unfortunately, and there's hardly any public land. There's a parking lot there. There's some right off Cunliffe, and then there's one little tiny sliver, which is basically a cliff. And then the other public land is Winghaven Park. As you can see, it's not perfectly under the line. When you get the trigonometry of the situation is that when you're really close, the altitude predominates. So when you're computing your slant distance, which is between you and the overflying aircraft, when you get close enough is generally close enough because the altitude is what predominates in terms of your distance to the airplane. But they're all private. And many of these homeowners they're on my mailing list because they come to my meetings because obviously they're very impacted. And I have a noise monitor that I use. And I took measurements at some of these people's houses that are right on this. There's that one property on the bluff right above Dolphin Point, which would, in terms of actual noise signal from the airplane, it's perfect. There's very few trees. They've cleared it, so it's a nice bluff, and that helps for a lot of reasons. The problem is that the ferry noise is really loud there. You can hear the engines run in reverse when it's actually holding it against the dock, and you can hear all the traffic offloading. And in a loud private property, that really high noise signal would make it not as attractive as you would think just looking at it naively. Really, the only thing near the north end that is public property and that is relatively close to that line of all the focus planes is Winghaven Park. Now, for those of you that have hiked in Winghaven Park, there's a trail that goes kind of along, starting Cunliffe, and it goes down to the water. That's lower Winghaven Park. There's this completely unknown section of Winghaven Park, which is to the north. And if you ever looked from the north, when you're down along the water there's a cliff, basically. Well, this is a bluff on top of that cliff, and it's completely inaccessible. The people that live next to that, who are also on my list, by the way, because they're heavily impacted by the noise, they've lived there, I think, 18 years. They've never seen a single soul visiting that section of the park because it's uninhabitable. But it's a nice flat section, and about 1.3 acres to basically choose from in terms of where to put the monitor. Interestingly, I was worried about how close it was to the highway and the ferry, and I went down there with my noise monitor when ferries were offloading, and I heard nothing. The reason is because there's a big hill between them and the highway. So the topology, it's like, a 100-foot tall berm, basically, and it just completely drowned. you don't hear the noise from the ferry or the highway offload at all. The people that live there told me that sometimes when they go over the rumble strips, they can hear that. That's just occasionally when someone drives over the rumble strips. So I have the pluses there are the positive things about the site. The negatives are it's 100 feet west. It would be ideal if it was under, but again, the trigonometry, when you're 5,000 feet below a target and then 1,000 feet west of it, it's not that much of a difference from being directly underneath it. And the most important, when you're that close, the altitude predominates in terms of your actual slant distance to the target. But still, usually the port has a website they run called Public View, which shows all the planes in action as they fly over noise monitors. And from an aesthetic point of view, it would have been nice if the planes were flying directly over the noise monitor. That's purely an aesthetic thing, but it would have been nice to see that. But this is all the options that we have, especially on public property. This really seemed to be the. There is deciduous tree cover on the site, which actually doesn't the noise from the airplane that much. Interestingly, vegetation takes a lot of vegetation to drown out sound. That's why you have to build a very deep hedge to go and make a significant difference. The one thing it does do, and I experienced this when I've been down at the site doing test measurements, is there's a lot of birds. Birds like trees, and in windstorms, trees make a lot of noise. But the fact is, this is what most people live with on Vashon. I mean, these are pleasant sounds, right? But for the noise monitor, they're all the same. Now, that being said, it was only in the 30s, mid 30 decibels, which is still really low. Yes, Nick.
What about that right up there on the west side of the highway? That's right at the old Island Arms and Curious corner. That whole gigantic field that's right there. What about that location?
Along the highway?
Yeah.
Anything along the highway is going to have high highway noise.
Oh, well, let me interject, Nick. If you don't mind, this is just a presentation for a vote. It's not scheduled as a discussion. So if we could hold our questions on this, if you want to participate in the committee, that's fine. But I'd appreciate it if we could hold questions, okay?
Yeah, I will just add one thing that might make it really obvious here is that as these planes are heading north, they're descending. So for instance, they're well over 1,000 feet higher in town. So when you're basically, if you do try to put it further south, you're going to be a lot further away and you'll have less of a noise signal. So you really do want to be as far north as possible. I'll just add that to it. And then after I'm done, if there's time, we can take more questions on that. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is actually my last slide. So we voted on this site and it was unanimous. I will say I've been scouting sites for the last 4 or 5 years on the island, with actual noise monitors and actually trying to find it. And I think to take advantage of capturing the impact of NextGen on Vashon with the limitation of public property, this looks to be the best choice. So that's my presentation. Is there time for questions? I'm not looking at the clock, so I don't know.
And you took a vote in your committee.
Yes.
And yes. What was the result of the vote?
Unanimous.
Okay. And so at this point, your proposal to cite the, now, were you able to address the issues of getting electricity to the monitor? Yeah, there are 3 options that we looked at. The Vashon Park District, Elaine Ott, contact Puget Sound Energy, and it's doable. It costs money to do it. There's a solar option available from the manufacturer of the noise monitors, and there's another contractor, a system integrator called L3 Harris that would actually do it, and they'd be responsible for the engineering on it. And then the other option is there's a local vendor called Artisan Electric, who's a very prominent solar company in the Seattle area that's happened to be located on it. Well, they actually moved from Vashon recently because they got too big. They could create a turnkey solution that would look as if you just had an outlet sitting in the woods. So there's 3 different options. All of them would work, different costs. The cheapest and probably the best one is to have the vendor themselves go and actually use the solar options that the manufacturer provides. So these are 3 separate options we can present to the port. Okay.
That all of them would work.